Today, I'm going to present an intuitive argument that says if we think about it just a bit, we should all feel strongly compelled to stop eating factory farm meat. So, I'm sure you've already heard vegan arguments that say we must stop eating meat entirely, that we must consider animals equally to humans, and that animals even have rights like you and I. So, I'm not going to be arguing any of that, and I'll only be arguing from premises I think most people already agree with. Uh, how this will go is I'll just outline the basic argument, and then I'll address the major objections to it, and I'll conclude with some helpful information to help guide your change. Also, at the end, I'll of course include my sources and some reading suggestions I found most relevant to the topic. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy. All right, so here's the basic argument. Premise one, it is wrong to inflict extreme pain and suffering on others, especially for relatively minor benefits. I mean, this should really just be as intuitive a basic moral principle as really any other. If this isn't intuitively correct, I really don't know what is. But okay, so premise two, factory farming inflicts extreme pain and suffering on others for the sake of relatively minor benefits. Three, therefore, factory farming is wrong. If something is wrong, it's wrong to pay people for it too. Buying factory farm products is paying people for factory farming. Therefore, buying factory farm products is wrong. And the conclusion is, of course, that you should stop buying factory farm products. So I said the principle in premise one is as intuitive as any other basic moral principle, and it certainly is, but the contention here is, of course, going to be whether or not animals fall under the consideration of others here, and that will be a, kind of the primary topic of this presentation. And then, of course, the only other questions are, do we only get relatively minor benefits from factory farming? And does factory farming inflict extreme pain and suffering on these animals? So before proceeding, I wanted to just note this more direct argument that I could have made. So premise one, it's wrong to torture animals, especially unnecessarily. I think most people already agree with this. So premise two, factory farming does in fact unnecessarily torture animals, and therefore factory farming is wrong. And then the argument proceeds the same way it did before. The reason I didn't use this argument is because some people will take issue with the use of the term torture here. And although I do think it's appropriate to use the term, and I will have a short discussion on that, I really just think it's an unnecessary digression. And I want the main focus here to be whether or not we should consider animals enough that we shouldn't do what we do to them in factory farming. So basically, we have the minimal obligation to not inflict extreme suffering on animals when we don't have to, or do something that really looks like torture when we do not have to. And I think most people will already agree with this. But yeah, I just want to clarify that when I say consider, that we should consider animals, I don't mean in any sense more than that. But my own personal view on it is that there are varying moral degrees, so I disagree with the vegans who think that we need to consider animals equally to humans. But I think they're much closer to being correct than how we currently treat them. Like, when we look at the way we currently treat animals in factory farming, it looked like we don't consider them at all. So I think that's really, really, really wrong. And I think the vegans who think we should consider them equally to humans are, they're wrong too, but they're much closer to correct. So yeah, factory farming is very bad. The lives of animals in factory farming are worse than those of any group of humans on Earth, even the least well off, so long as they do not live in literal torture chambers. Just to focus on the numbers real quick, I'll get to specific practices in the next slide. So 80 billion animals are slaughtered for food yearly, including 9 to 10 billion land animals in the US, 99% of them in factory farms. These numbers don't include the billions of animals who die on farms before reaching a slaughterhouse, like the male chickens who, when the factory farm sees that they're male and they're not going to be of use to them, they just throw them in the grinder. So that 80 billion doesn't count them, nor does it include the additional billions of aquatic animals killed after life in factory farming each year. So just for a little perspective, there have been roughly 117 billion humans to ever live on the Earth. So in 2 years, we kill more animals after inflicting extreme suffering and pain on them in factory farming than there have been humans on the Earth in human history. So here are just a few practices that are involved in, or very prevalent in factory farming. So first, they're genetically engineered so they can barely move because, they gotta plump them up so much. But they're plumped up past their skeleton can hold, so they like literally can't walk. They live in pure filth. They live and sleep in their own shit, and it's cheaper for the factory farm companies instead of cleaning up this area. It's cheaper for them to just pour chemicals. And so the animals also spend their time choking on ammonia and, of course, being burned by the acidic feces around them. Their offspring, especially so cows are specific to this point, their offspring are taken from them within 24 to 48 hours of birth. And of course, this is very stressful for these cows. Body parts like beaks and tails are cut while bulls are castrated, all with no anesthetic or pain relief after the fact. Most get no daylight and are confined to cages barely exceeding their own body in size. Um, the list of horrors does go on, but I'm not going to exhaust it, and I don't think I need to, because I think this is enough. If you treated a dog in ways even approaching this level of torture, you would rightly be arrested. And more on this in the next slide. So Alistair Norcross from Colorado University gives us this really fun thought of Fred's basement in his paper, Puppies, Pigs, and People, which I recommend in the later reading suggestions. So our friend Fred, he gets a visit from the police one day because the neighbors were disturbed by strange sounds coming from his basement. And when the police get there and they enter the basement, they're absolutely horrified by the scene. There's 26 small wire cages, each with a puppy inside, some whining, some whimpering, some howling. And the puppies range in age from newborn to about 6 months. Many of them show signs of mutilation. Urine and feces cover the bottom of the cages and the basement floor. And Fred explains that he keeps the puppies for 26 weeks and then butchers them while holding them upside down. During their lives, he performs a series of mutilations on them, such as slicing off their noses and their paws with a hot knife, all without any form of anesthesia. And he does this because due to their confinements, they go so insane and they start biting each other. So instead of giving them better conditions, he just makes sure that they can't bite each other. So except for the mutilations, the puppies are never allowed out of the cages, which are barely big enough to hold them, and they're genetically engineered to be too plump, even for their own skeletons. So as details of the case are publicized, the public is rightfully outraged. Newspapers are flooded with letters demanding that Fred be severely punished for his horrific animal abuse. So the point here is that, well, all Professor Norcross is doing is giving us an example of, well, what factory farming is. And if you're rightfully disturbed by this case, as we would be, you should also be rightfully disturbed by factory farming. I don't think this really needs to be stressed too much, but some people still have this view of animals as like brutes just responding to stimuli or something with no real experience. But yeah, so this isn't true. It's scientific consensus that at least all vertebrates experience pain, as well as some invertebrates. So for example, like your cephalopods, like your octopuses and squid, and then decapod crustaceans as well. So these are going to be your crabs, lobsters, and crayfish. And then just a couple examples to provide intuitive support of the fact that animals do experience is that when they're hurt, they'll cry out, guard an injured limb, and so forth. They presumably wouldn't do that if they weren't experiencing anything. Perhaps the greatest indicator that they do experience is that they exhibit behavioral flexibility. And we can just ask the question, like if animals are, they're just brutes, like some people think, without real emotions or experiences, then where did a human emotion come from? And then finally, the last consideration I'll provide is that animals, they do develop their own personality, we could call it. And, if you've ever had a cat or any pet, you know this. So, is it torture what we do in factory farms? Well, it seems like to most people, just hearing the realities of factory farming, they'll conclude that it is torture, or they'll at least be okay with someone else saying it's torture. But I had a pedantic conversation with someone a little bit ago about the definition of torture, and they insisted that factory farming does not fall under that definition. So here's the definition of torture: the intentional infliction of severe physical or mental pain or suffering. And of course, the word intent here is what some people get hung up on, saying factory farming isn't specifically intending to inflict severe physical or mental pain and suffering on animals. They definitely do it, just not with a specific intent. Well, remember our buddy Fred? Well, the police got there and they were so horrified and they were going to bring him in. But then Fred goes, whoa, 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 hold on. I wasn't intending to harm them with the specific goal to inflict severe pain and suffering on these animals. I just really liked the taste of their flesh. That was my intent. So I wanted that, and I wanted people around me to also be able to enjoy the taste of their flesh. And actually, I just wanted to maximize my profits of selling this tasty flesh to other people. But I didn't intend. Uh, you know, this doesn't really seem like a good response for Fred here. The principle here that we should be drawing is that if you're doing something knowing with 100% certainty that you will cause an outcome, there really ceases to be a real moral line between that and just direct intent. We can imagine a drone strike. So a military officer is going to command a drone strike on an area to, let's say, take out a weapons cache in a factory. But he knows that doing so will kill, let's say, 100 civilians, or we could just say severely harm them. Still, he decides to do it anyways. It really seems like him saying he didn't intend the death and harm of those civilians doesn't really seem morally relevant here. And then just imagine like he was doing daily drone strikes, 80 billion a year, let's say, for no reason in particular, of course. Would we really want to say that there was no intent here? Well, no, of course we'd say there's intent here. And if you still somehow don't think so, then we could just replace the word torture with the 100% foreseeable and unabashed, unnecessarily inflicted extreme and prolonged suffering and distress, for example, and then list all the things that occur in factory farms. But I think it's okay for us to just say torture here. So, given the fact that animals do experience and they do, in fact, suffer in factory farming, it's really difficult to see what benefits could possibly outweigh this level of atrocity. But whatever those benefits might be, we definitely don't get them from factory farming. Uh, you know, the most obvious benefit that we get is the enjoyment of the taste of their flesh. But this is really just going to be nothing in the face of mass and continuous torture. And it's not like all vegetarian meals are just terrible. Um, the next thing people think is that we need to do this. That is, we need this level of meat consumption, so we need to keep factory farming since there are so many people. But this just isn't true. There are roughly 80 billion vegans in the world today, and study after study supports the health outcomes of a balanced vegetarian diet. And I'm not even saying you have to cut out meat consumption, just the kind that involve the torture of animals. And I said study after study supports the health outcomes of a balanced vegetarian diet, and I link some individual studies and meta-analyses in the references section at the end of this video. The next concern is, of course, cost, with many people thinking veganism is just too expensive, but this too is a misguided concern. In countries in America, at least, this is only really true for the high-end processed meat substitutes, prepackaged vegan meals, gourmet vegan cheeses, and so forth. But for other foods characteristic of a plant-based diet, like beans, rice, lentils, oats, frozen vegetables, potatoes, and so forth, I mean, these are just some of the cheapest foods on the planet. Whole foods, vegan, or vegetarian diets are actually the most cost-effective options available in upper middle income to high income countries on average, uh, 22 to 34% cheaper than our regular diets. And I link this analysis in the references as well. Taking all of this into account, our practice of paying for exploited and tortured animal products does in fact only provide relatively minor benefits. And you can probably expect some benefits from stopping. All right, so factory farming is really bad. Animals do, in fact, experience every bit of it, and we presumably only get fairly minor benefits from it, at least relative to the extreme suffering of animals. So the only question left is why should we care? Why should I include animals in my consideration of others from the first premise of my argument? Well, I mean, doesn't this seem kind of odd to ask at this point? But of course, it's the main point of contention. Why should we consider the suffering and exploitation of animals at all? And the answer to this is pretty simple. It's just that to avoid a system of ethics, that's just a collection of personal biases. Any line drawn between who counts and who doesn't has to be based on a morally relevant difference. And if that difference can't be articulated, if there is no difference, then that supposed difference is arbitrary, and we ought not act based on arbitrary distinctions. We definitely shouldn't torture based on arbitrary distinctions. I think most people will agree with that. So the question is there a relevant difference between us and non-human animals such that it's okay for us to torture and exploit them as we please? After all, they too have lives that can go good or bad for them. They have their own subjective experiences as well as emotional and social lives, and they can suffer in a way that's presumably similar to us. I can't quite imagine what it would be like to be a chicken or a cow, but I can imagine what it would be like to be conscious and have my nose cut off without anesthetic, and what it would be like to sleep in my own shit, what it would be like to not be able to stretch my arms or legs my whole life, what it would be like for my child to be ripped from me a day after birth, and so forth until my eventual slaughtering. And again, all of this seems akin to, torture. So why isn't this worth consideration? Why shouldn't animals be included as others in my argument? So if you can't think of a sufficient distinction, then you should readily agree with my argument and stop buying factory farm products. I, of course, think there is no sufficient distinction that justifies factory farming, but people have a lot that they try to put forth, so I'll spend the next part of this discussion overviewing and responding to each. So the first distinction people usually give between animals and humans that's supposed to justify how we treat animals, in factory farming especially, is just that humans are smarter. Where we've got this technology and we develop languages and so forth. You could give all the examples in the world. And yeah, so humans are so much more intellectually superior than animals, so we can do whatever we want to them, including torture them unnecessarily. Well, this just can't really be the case. Intelligence can't be the metric here, because then rights and consideration of suffering would scale with IQ or something like it, which nobody believes we should actually do. Um, you can imagine like so infants and the severely mentally disabled, like humans, they score lower on cognitive tests than some animals. So it seemed really odd to then say that the animals deserve more consideration than the infants and the severely disabled. And what about like Albert Einstein? He's way smarter than, well, I shouldn't say that. He's certainly way smarter than me. I know I've got some very genius viewers who watch my videos, but so Albert Einstein is much, much smarter than I am. Does that mean his suffering matters more than mine? Probably not, because I meet that threshold where my suffering matters. And okay, what about like super intelligent aliens? So suppose the aliens did someday come across us and they're just like way superior intellectually to us. Would it be okay for them to torture us without care until they slaughter us for food just because they're more intelligent? Probably not. But probably the most important thing here is that like the cited abilities that people usually give for this intelligence argument, they just dictate what a being can do, but we don't think it dictates what can be done to them. And again, if we did, infants who often have lower cognitive testing metrics than an adult pig or dog would seemingly lose their basic right to not be tortured and exploited. All right, the second distinction people usually give that's supposed to justify factory farming is that animals can't reciprocate the social contract. So, since morality is a two-way street and a cow can't respect your rights and suffering, you have no obligation to respect theirs, right? Well, no, this just really ignores the distinction between moral agents, those who can understand rules and act morally, like adult humans or anybody watching this video, and moral patients, those who cannot formulate moral rules but are still very vulnerable to harm and deserve moral consideration, like human infants, the severely disabled, and animals. We don't expect a toddler to respect our property rights, but the fact that they can't obviously gives us no reason to undermine our basic moral obligation to not harm them, certainly not to torture and exploit them as we please. All right, we've made it to the infamous food chain argument. Comes in many forms, but here I just put it this way. Humans are apex predators, so eating animals is a natural biological practice. Sometimes people will say something like, "Oh, animals kill animals, but we're just really good at it," or something like that, and then they'll throw in, lions eat meat too, why can't we? There are a few things to say here. First, this really only seems to attempt to justify eating meat in some capacity. Doesn't really say anything about a distinction between our suffering and that of animals, such that it's okay for us to exploit and torture them, which is what factory farming is, and that's the topic here. Uh, Second, we might have the biological capability to do something, but generally that doesn't mean we should do it when we have modern alternatives that don't require inflicting immense suffering on animals. So, for example, a professional fighter has the ability to just take anybody's shit or whatever they want, but it's obviously wrong for them to do so. And we have the ability to steal candy from babies, and that candy might taste pretty good too, but it's obviously wrong to do so, despite the fact that we could easily do it. As for the lions eat meat, why shouldn't we? Well, I just don't think we should be living like lions. Uh, just because something occurs in nature really doesn't mean it's morally right or permissible for humans to do. Forced copulation is incredibly prevalent in the animal kingdom, but of course we find it deeply immoral for humans to do. Other moral horrors like cannibalism are also regular in the animal kingdom, and if someone cited the fact of natural occurrence and that other animals do it as justification for them or other humans to do it, we would rightfully deem them monstrous. Wild predators like lions also don't have moral agency. They have no capacity to reflect on and evaluate their actions. They're just killing out of strict biological necessity. We, on the other hand, have moral agency. We can reflect on our actions and decide what's right or wrong, and we have the ability to live very healthily on plant-based diets. Even if we couldn't live perfectly healthily on plant-based diets, we could certainly be more cautious about our levels of meat consumption and how we treat animals in the process and minimize it to what is necessary. Perhaps the most popular distinction is really just the next step to the intelligence and social contract arguments. And it's just to say something like, well, individuals get consideration not because of what they can do right now, but because of their belonging to a kind of being that is typically characterized by those traits. So, since humans characteristically engage in moral social contracts or are more intelligent than animals, they can exploit and torture them without care. Well, as appealing as this might initially be, uh, it really just seems like arbitrary discrimination. You know, I treat all members of Group X better than Group Y because Group X is the kind that has special traits. Really, it seems like in any other topic, we'd immediately recognize this as prejudice, and we generally shouldn't be prejudiced. But also, just because an individual belongs to a group that usually has property X, it's not really clear why that specific individual deserves rights if they lack property X themselves. You know, all humans are the kind of being that can see, so they can drive. But, if you can't see, you have no right to drive, regardless of your kind, biologically, anyways, as is used by the anti-vegan here. So it's really not clear how this gets away from the infant and mentally disabled issue from earlier. They are moral patients until they actually have the relevant capacities that constitute being a moral agent, and if they never have these capacities, they simply remain moral patients. So why shouldn't we just apply the same to animals? We might also further challenge this seemingly arbitrary use of kind. I might say humans animals are the same kind of being, namely subjects of lives, conscious feeling beings whose lives can go better or worse from their points of view. And since animals who are not moral agents are still of the same kind, since they are still subjects of lives, these animals still have rights and deserve at least minimal consideration to not be tortured and exploited. I really fail to see why this view is somehow less preferable, or there at least seems to be no reliable way to decide which is the better account. I could also fully remove the moral agent talk and just say we are of the same kind, as in subjects of experience who can suffer, so we deserve moral consideration. Seemingly, this would actually be preferable since it directly encompasses marginal cases like infants and the severely mentally disabled. And if I didn't explain that too well, recall the hypothetical advanced alien species that might come and find us one day, and they might identify some traits that they have that make them so much more special and superior to us. Seemingly, it's not going to be okay to torture and exploit and eat us as they please. Um, I've also got a lot of questions for this view here. You can pause and look at it. I'm not going to read them all off. So, some people might be quite convinced by arguments in favor of veganism, but they'll say they're just not going to go vegan because it won't change much at all about the factory farming or meat industry. This might be similar to people not voting or taking any political action because their one vote isn't going to change anything. And this is a pretty common sentiment, but I just find it puzzling because we really wouldn't respond this way to any other moral issue. To give an extreme example, suppose you lived in early 1800s America and owned just one singular slave. You think long and hard about this grave moral issue and decide slavery is very bad. And freeing your one singular slave, though, will likely do nothing to change the institution of slavery, but I'll assume everybody would do it nonetheless because of these strong moral reasons. Of course, this isn't to compare eating meat or factory farming to owning slaves, but if you find vegan arguments convincing or at a minimum believe factory farming is morally wrong, the fact that you aren't going to solve the problem by yourself is really not good reason against stopping your own contribution to it. I could just give you a much less extreme example as well. So imagine you find a guy selling high-end, obviously stolen laptops out of the back of his van for $100. You need a new laptop. You know that if you walk away, someone else will buy it within 10 minutes. Your individual refusal to buy it will not stop the theft ring, nor the laptop be returned to its owner. Still, most people would agree that buying the laptop is morally wrong, so they wouldn't do it. And then we can just consider this logical note. So, number one, a small change in x never makes a difference to y. Number two, a large change in x makes a difference to y. Number three, a large change in x can be made up of many small changes in x, so one must be false. Here we could let X be number of individual meat purchases and Y be total meat production. So you can't really say you'll make no difference, and usually we like to make some change to practices we deem to be immoral. And many small changes are generally necessary for a large change in X. The vegan movement altogether certainly does something about the factory farming and broader meat eating industry, and if it weren't compromised of many individuals making small changes, it could not do so. Perhaps you've heard the infamous meme of going vegan is gonna make me a beta feminized soy boy. Um, I think I think this really got popular after one of those Ben Shapiro clips of him dunking on college kids or whatever, and I think a vegan came up to him talking about it, and then yeah, I think it got popular from there. I'm not sure though. It's just that they say like eating soy products like tofu raises estrogen levels and feminizes men. They also cite like reproductive harms or whatever. So study after study just disproves this. Soy consumption does not affect human testosterone levels, nor does it cause any reproductive changes in men. I put some studies in the links at the end. And yes, you can be a vegan bodybuilder too. I also provided information on that. Of course, you just have to watch your diet. So I wanted to quickly just note a few of the major additional benefits of veganism. Of course, there are more, but these are the ones that I find most important. It's cheaper. It's 23 to 34% cheaper, like I said earlier. So the environment helps us cut back on greenhouse gas emissions, definitely helps us conserve water and use land more efficiently. As for health, vegan and vegetarian diet helps with heart disease, blood pressure, blood sugar, overall immune function, and so forth. I put a lot of that research in the sources later to come. And global food security and resource inefficiency is probably one of the most important considerations here. So it's of course going to be far less efficient to feed plants to animals and then eat the animal rather than just eating the plants ourselves. Cutting out the middleman presumably lets us feed more people with the same amount of land and resources, which is a good thing. Before I get to the closing summary and everything, and then reading suggestions and references, of course, I want to just make some quick clarifications. So, one, facing roadblocks with veganism does not mean give it up entirely. You can minimize consumption, and that's very, very good, while just, running over the roadblock, we'll say. So, for example, if you're at a family gathering and there's only only factory farm meals, just eat the damn food. It's not an argument against veganism. A lot of people say like, oh, if I go vegan, I'm not going to be able to be social. Like, I'm not going to be able to go to restaurants with my friends or have Christmas dinner or what have you. Really, I mean, there's options at most restaurants, but if you can't just eat the food and minimize your consumption, otherwise, that's probably going to be fine. That's probably better than starving for the time being or having no social life at all. So yeah, okay. The next thing, if you're not an edge case, don't make objections like, well, 0.5% of the population will get blah 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 disease from going vegan, or oh, what about the Inuit in Alaska? You really expect them to go vegan? Well, no, presumably the Inuit in Alaska are probably not eating factory farm meat, and that's my contention here. But also, if you're not an Inuit and you're part of the 99.5% of people who won't get some disease or die from going vegan, you shouldn't be making this point. If you are, then it's fine. Don't go vegan. It's fine. And then again, I just want to clarify, at least in the considerations that I've presented here, you can still eat meat, just not the factory farmed kind, but be very wary of companies just saying humanely raised, as chances are they're lying. I'll talk about more of that in a moment. All right, so the reason I chose to and generally choose to just talk about factory farming instead of stricter vegan arguments is that the stricter ones are harder to convince people of. They're more dense argumentatively. There's more back and forth about them. And, it turns out most people actually aren't okay with animal torture. So it's really not that hard to convince people of the conclusions that I'm drawing in this presentation. And perhaps the most important thing to consider here is that 99% of animals raised for food are in factory farms. So it's probably more important to just get people to this point, especially if it's fairly easy to convince them of this point. It seems more helpful for animal welfare than more dense arguments about rights and equal consideration and so forth. And a lot of people have this view of veganism, and this might be the fault of vegans for, usually making these stricter and more abstract arguments about animal rights and the idea that they need to be considered equally to humans, and stuff like this. So people have this view of veganism that just seems, well, absurd to them. And so they think about it and it's just like, oh, these crazy demanding vegans, and they don't really think about the topic that much. So they never really realize that there's this idea that you can just be against factory farming, and that's very beneficial to animals and the general vegan movement. So it's just, I think it's more effective and better to just focus on factory farming. So I mentioned that you can be very healthy and you can actually get health benefits from switching to a vegetarian or vegan diet, which is absolutely true, and the research does absolutely support that. But there's an important caveat in all of that research, and it's well balanced. You have to make sure that you're watching your diet and making sure you're getting everything you need. You know, if you're eating meat, you're having just the average diet of what an average American eats. You know, you're going to probably get what you need, and you'll probably actually get too much of what you need pretty easily. And you know, of course, here I've only been talking about factory farmed products, so maybe you'll be fine just eating non-factory farm meat, and your diet won't change. But if you do, I'll probably end up making a video about some stuff like this, watching your diet on vegetarian or vegan diet. But for now, I'll just say go to veganhealth.org. They've got a lot of good information there. And there's plenty of studies on this stuff about like what specifically you should be eating in a day and what have you. So yeah, I just wanted to make that note real quick. So the main point in this presentation is really just that if you can't come up with a sufficient distinction between the experiences and suffering of humans and non-human animals, such that we're justified in exploiting and torturing them on such a large scale, you should be quite strongly against factory farming, and you should stop financially contributing to factory farming. It's really important to remember that most people in any era of any immoral practice are really just going along with what those around them are saying and doing without trying too hard to be good or bad or thinking too hard about what is right or wrong. So here, I just want to recall the scale of factory farming. So there have been 117 billion humans to ever inhabit the earth. We kill 80 billion animals after a life in factory farming every single year. So if we just like added up the suffering, if their suffering does matter, this might be one of the worst things that humans have ever done. It probably is one of the worst things humans have ever done, and we just continue the practice year by year without thinking about it. So yeah, but enough of that. There'll be more of that in the next slide. So labels and phrasing, Farm Forward's guide is going to be the best. They're very intent on cutting out the humane washing and sort of tricky language companies use to try to sound better while still being quite cruel. You need to be really wary of these companies doing this sort of thing where they'll just put like a humanely raised stamp or like high welfare standards or something, and all they really mean is they don't cut the beaks off without an anesthetic or something like that. Or some of them don't even do anything, and it's just they just put a label on there. So you definitely need to be following one of these guides. Shop with your heart. I think it's now called ASPCA Shop Kind. It tells you where you can find high welfare products nearby, so that's very helpful. I really just recommend these, and I'll get to more of that later, but because other guides, they're maybe not so rigorous in their research, or there's some issue with them, but these are very reliable. If you've made it to the end of this presentation, I really appreciate you watching. I know it's been a really long video, but I think this is a very important topic. But I do just want to say that if you continue eating factory farm products after this presentation, all I can really say is that you'll have to just be okay with knowingly supporting the severe torture of literally trillions of innocent animals over your lifetime. And like, why? Why are you going to do this after seeing this presentation? The distinctions that people try to give, it seems like all of them obviously don't work. And if you think there's another response to give, please let me know in the comments and I promise I will respond. But if they all don't work, all that's left is like a lack of moral motivation or, some small personal sacrifices. And, this is just not going to be okay because we wouldn't say this about any other topic that we find to be like really bad. I've tried really hard to stay away from morally condemning people who eat meat. I don't think that's productive or really the right thing to do here. And I've tried to avoid comparing factory farming to past atrocities because I know it puts people off. But if we recall the scale again, like 117 billion humans have ever inhabited the earth, and we kill 80 billion animals in factory farming after they're life of torture and suffering and agony in factory farming every single year. So the scale is very large here. And I'll invoke one example of a past atrocity. So um, Thomas Jefferson, in his writings, you can go read them, but that's not really the topic here. But I want to use it to make this point. He called slavery an abomination. He was personally against it. But over his lifetime, he had 600 slaves, 600 of them over his lifetime, even though he called it an abomination. And we might ask, well, why is this? Well, obviously, he was influenced by what was going on around him, and it was just a normal thing. So, and now I'm not saying that you have to, I'm not saying anybody watching this video hates animals or something, or is like vehemently like speciesist or something, but you are necessarily going to be influenced by what's going on around you in your society, and you're probably going to ignore a lot of the things that are probably pretty bad that are going on in your society, and you're going to be influenced by prejudice and, the fact that you've been eating this factory farm meat your whole life. Whatever. I don't really want to go deep into analyzing it, but it's important that we don't let those influences outweigh the moral badness of the situation. So again, I didn't go too far into how egregious the treatment and suffering of animals is in factory farming, because I didn't want this to be so gruesome. I know it probably already was. And as gruesome as it was, I promise I just needed to make the points. But I'll make one note here in closing. Whatever the worst experience you've ever had is in terms of pain, animals in factory farming experience something worse than that daily, like debilitating agony every single day of their lives. So like if you can imagine the most pain you've ever experienced, you probably couldn't think of like anything else in the world other than that pain. Animals experience that or worse every single day of their lives in factory farming. All right, I know this topic has been probably pretty grim, so I want to end off on a positive note. Please consider donating to an animal welfare charity. They'll do a lot more with your money than you just changing your lifestyle ever will. So you can go on animalcharityevaluators.com, and they have the most effective animal welfare charities listed there. There's of course many more, but I think that that's a good starting place. So for example, donating just $1 to the Humane League will help 12 animals. So if you spend just $10, you'll be helping more than 100 animals. That's pretty worth it to me. And then while you're here, please watch my video on why we ought to donate to global charity for humans. And the cow and I say thank Moo. So here are some reading suggestions. Of course, other people would have a different list, but this is mine, and I thought I'd add it at the end. So the first three here: Slaughterhouse, Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism, and then this paper, Puppies, Pigs, and People by Alistair Norcross. I think these are the three most important to read on here. So Slaughterhouse, you can get that on Amazon for like $15. Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism by Michael Huemer. I think the first edition is only like $15. The second edition is better, but I think it's $30 on Amazon. The first edition is just fine, but the second edition is certainly better. And of course, if you can get Animal Liberation Now, so Peter Singer, I mean, he's the one who started this whole this animal welfare movement with his book Animal Liberation, the first one in I believe 1975 maybe. So it's worth reading his book too, but yeah, I think the first three are the best. So here are some really good labels and shopping guides. I really don't recommend using anything other than these. I'm sure there are probably other good ones, and if people know about it, they can let me know, and that's awesome. But a lot of the other sites that aren't these four can be, kind of flawed, and maybe their research isn't so rigorous or something. But yeah, so these are the best ones. And of course, here's my references. You can just pause as I'm going through each of these.